Good afternoon. Welcome to Remaking the Economy, How to Change Our Stories About the Economy. I'm Steve Dubb, Senior Editor of Economic Justice here at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation.
And I'm Trevor Smith, co-founder and executive director of the BLIS Collective, which stands for Black Liberation, Indigenous Sovereignty.
Thanks. For this webinar, co-moderated by MPQ and BLIS, our panelists are Peggy Bailey, who is Vice President for Housing and Income Security at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities based in Washington, D.C. Jessica Yupanqui Feingold is co-CEO of Common Future and is based in Brooklyn, New York. Jeremie Greer is co-founder and co-executive director of Liberation in a Generation based in Washington, D.C. And Nick Tilson is co-founder and CEO of the NDN Collective based in Minnelusahan, which is also known as Rapid City in South Dakota. A few notes. First, we're very excited to take your questions. Please enter your questions into the question box at the bottom of your screen, and we will share as many of them as we can. We will reserve the last 30 minutes of the webinar for your questions. Second, we will share the slides and recording after the webinar, so no need to ask, will I get the slides and the recording? You will. Generally, they arrive by Monday. One last thing, this webinar is free, but producing it is not. So if you like what we are doing and can afford to support MPQ's racial and economic justice work, please consider making a donation to MPQ today. We also encourage you to join the conversation via social media with our hashtag #RebuildTheEconomy. Thanks for joining us, and please do complete the brief survey after the webinar, which does inform our future work. And with that, before going to our panelists, I'll pass the baton to Trevor, who will offer a few framing comments regarding today's webinar.
Thanks so much, Steve. It's been such a great whirlwind of a day as BLIS launched our website and LinkedIn today. And so I'm so glad that this event is part of BLIS's story. One of my favorite quotes that I keep coming back to as I look for inspiration as we get BLIS off the ground comes from a historian, James Frazier, who said, "Our inability to look at things as if they could be otherwise is one of society's greatest challenges." This inability to see beyond the status quo, to look at our reality, one that is marked by significant inequality across racial, gender, and economic lines, it's cemented because of stories and narratives, which we define as the summation of stories that make us believe that inequality is natural and that there's not much we can do about it. BLIS is founded on the notion and the mandate that stories, public memory, collective consciousness, and societal values play a large role in policy and systems change. If we are to pass policies that create a more equitable economy, then we have to have much more robust movement and narrative infrastructure. Our mission at BLIS is to do just that. Build narrative infrastructure, which we define as the interconnected systems, services, and platforms that enable perceptions and understandings to be constructed, shared, and evolved. We're building this infrastructure across Black, Indigenous, and transformative social movements. This infrastructure will help support a broad base of people into socializing what we call liberatory social identities, who are advocating for policies that create a better society for us all. This webinar in collaboration with NPQ is born out of the idea that not only can we see things otherwise, we must see things otherwise if we want to have long-lasting policy and systems change. And the only way we believe that we can do that at BLIS is through radical collaboration and narrative alignment. So when Steve and I were thinking about who could be on this panel, we thought of folks who are seeding new narratives, running campaigns, have a seat at legislative tables, who partner with grassroots organizations who are developing new paradigms and ways of thinking about the economy and funding new and innovative organizations and businesses. Peggy, Jeremie, Jess, and Nick have all supported me and now BLIS in various ways in my career, and it is an honor to bring them together to have what I know is going to be a rich and informative conversation. The one thing that I ask for the audience to hold throughout this conversation is to ask yourself these two questions. Am I part of a social movement? If so, which? And if not, why? And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Steve.
Thanks, Trevor. And I think I'm going to pass the baton to Jeremie to begin us off. Jeremie, could you introduce yourself and maybe talk briefly about your notion of what you call confronting the oppression economy?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. It's so excited to be here. Exciting for BLIS to be getting off the ground here with good friends and partners. I have my Common Future swag on for all those in the audience. You should get yours. Yeah, so I'm co-executive director of Liberation Generation. My co-founder, Solana Rice, and I founded Liberation Generation in 2019. And we did so because we felt that the analysis of how the economy is meant to work was really failing efforts to advance economic liberation, and that a lot of the barriers we were putting forth were barriers of our own that we were just adopting and accepting. So we went out and we partner with grassroots organizers, with people who are looking to advance a different type of economy with a different kind of understanding, a different future, and moving towards a different future to really do that. And one of the things that we believe that's important in doing that is have a real, true assessment of what it is we're living in. And for us, that's what we call an oppression economy. An oppression economy is one that is built by design to suppress the economic vitality of Black, Brown, Indigenous folks intentionally. That is done by design, and it's done for the reason to advance, for the large part, the wealth of a very small group of white people. And that this was done from design, from the moment European boots landed on this continent, was done through the enslavement of Black folks, and has been done through the exploitation of Black and Brown folks in the economy ever since then. And that if we are going to move to a liberatory economy, one that we can imagine, one that we can create and bring into being, we have to first and foremost, and at the same time, dismantle this oppression economy. So that is really the work that we've set out to do at Liberation Generation, and excited to do it with fellow partners and fellow Voyagers, and look forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, Jeremie. Jess, we're going to come to you next. Can you introduce yourself? And I love the radical collaboration that's already going on. Jeremie's rocking CF swag. I was named a futurist in residence in Common Future today. So talk a little bit about yourself, Common Future, this Futurist in Residence program, and then also the kind of three pillars of your communications and narrative change work.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. And thank you to you both, Trevor and Steve, for hosting us today. I think it's a conversation among friends, co-conspirators, and future strong collaborators. And that's so evinced in the way that, Trevor, you've now joined us as a futurist in residence at Common Future. It's a way that we work extra organizationally. We have the work that we do, but we cannot do it unless we collaborate and coordinate across our institutions and really think beyond that, think as a movement ecosystem. So to introduce a little bit about myself as well as Common Future, I am Jess Chupanqui Feingold. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm seated here in Brooklyn today, which is formally stewarded by the Lenape and Canarsie peoples. And I am one of 3 co-CEOs at Common Future. Yes, you heard that, 3 co-CEOs. Co-leadership is fodder for another webinar and another future conversation. Feel free to reach out if you want to chat more about it. I believe it's the future of how we need to move in the justice space. And in my work at Common Future, our goal is really to make an equitable economy possible by investing in solutions that advance racial equity. And that is particular to Black and Indigenous communities, which is the way in which we found our alignment with BLIS and the work that the collective is doing around Black and Indigenous narratives around racial and economic justice. I joined Common Future about 6 years ago now, and then in the role as our Chief Strategy Officer. And at that point, we were not yet Common Future. That was not the organization's name. I came on to help us rebrand, to really become Common Future, and to tell a new story, one that was galvanizing and bring a racial justice lens to the work of creating an economy that works for all, because it will not work for all if we don't acknowledge the last 400 plus years of harm in this country and really speak about healing and what that may look like from perspective of intermediating and moving capital, but also one that goes much more deeply than that. And our Futurists in Residence program, as I mentioned, is a way of us to really deepen our work in narrative. We'll talk more about that today. Common Future has a 3-pillar approach to how we think about telling new stories. First is just strategic communications. We do the work a typical organization or nonprofit would do to publicize the work that we do, to share today on our Instagram the story of Trevor joining us as a futurist in residence, to announce our 10 women and non-binary BIPOC leaders of our accelerator cohort, which just launched this week. We'll tell the typical stories of the work that Common Future does to invest in folks directly and really uplift and spread awareness of work that's already happening to close the racial wealth gap. But we also have to invest in narrative. We have to invest in ways of telling a story that is shared. And so our second pillar really focuses on building narrative infrastructure, which we'll talk about more today. And last but not least, Allison Jones, who is our VP of Communications and Storytelling. She and I have come together to talk a lot about something we're trying out a brand for, but it's stealth communications. The idea that we see so many folks moving in ways that maybe their individual name as an actor or organization is not attributed, but we see their stories showing up. In fact, we see their stories showing up in very insidious ways. I think particularly around the backlash to DEI work, with Claudine Gay's recent resignation from Harvard, we see narratives operating through networks where they are incepted, they are implanted, they move, and they have real world consequences. What can we be learning from organizations that don't attribute their narratives, but have them widespread? These are folks that are changing the water we swim in. And so a question for Common Future and our partners is, how do we change the water that we're swimming in to be one that's really rooted in justice?
Thanks, Jess. That was great. Changing the water we're swimming in. I'll lift that up. I want to pass the baton to Peggy, if you could introduce yourself and your work at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and also talk about the value of framing, or really the critical importance of framing in housing justice work. And I know you have a bit to say on that.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Peggy Bailey. I'm the Vice President for Housing and Income Security here at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which is a DC-based think tank that works on programs on doing advocacy at the federal, state, and local level, on programs to help people with low incomes, and a little in the middle income space too, because that's where tax policy generally lies. And so, and you know, what I oversee our housing and income work, and that recently has come together. One of the challenges with how things work here in DC is that we think of things as very siloed, and we're very program focused. And in bringing together our housing and income work, what we're trying to do as a team is disrupt that and center people, right? People need more resources to be able to pay for the things that they need. And that shouldn't be program specific, and doing things the way that we've traditionally done them by focusing only on programs breaks people apart. It makes people have to fit into a box, and it's not putting the power in the person. Instead, it's putting the power in the government systems and structures that that currently exist. And along this, and what we're trying to do is go on this path toward justice, toward how do we orient our work every day toward a more just, toward a just future, rather than not being able to dream and think and live in a liberation space where we do expect for a just future to exist. I feel really strongly about that, because, you know, as we've traditionally talked about equity, and it never sat with me right. What are we moving toward? We're moving toward a world where people are just equally worse off. Like, that just doesn't seem to be where we're supposed to be going. And so our orientation toward justice, and all of us here being oriented toward justice, really has energized me about what we're here to try to do. And not only are we thinking about this here at the center from a housing and income space, but we have staff that are leading the entire organization through a justice-oriented framework to give us the tools to think about how we approach our work with justice in mind. So, for example, thinking about I don't know how we all feel about incrementalism, but it creates some indigestion for me. But that's the way things get done in DC. So how do we think about that and instead apply a justice lens, even if we're only making small changes? Because sometimes what happens is our egos get wrapped up in those small changes, and we think any small change is a win, when that is not the case. Oftentimes we do incremental things that actually disrupt our ability to be able to get to justice. And we say, well, since justice is so far out, or justice isn't possible, then it doesn't matter. We just need to take this win in the near term. And that can't happen anymore. We have to be able to orient our day-to-day work, even if it's small, on a path to justice, and make those hard choices in this near term that sometimes we have to make in order to adhere to that principle of justice and not take the easy win. Or if we do take the easy win, acknowledge what we've done, because now we've created another thing that has to be undone. And so that is that's really what's happening, the kind of conversations that we're having here internally at the center. And we're starting to engage with more partners externally to engage in this this kind of conversation as well. Because as I said, we can't let the unknown of what justice looks like, since we've never lived in it, to prevent us from trying to achieve it.
Thanks so much, Peggy. And last but not least, Nick, gonna come to you next. Can you introduce yourself? And I was saying to folks, or saying to Nick before, that I keep NDN Collective's Land Back magazine on me at all times, and I've been quoting it since it came out a couple months ago, I guess at this point. So Nick, can you introduce yourself if you want to talk a little bit about the Land Back magazine, the process that went into that, and talk a little bit about the need to acknowledge the harms of colonialism as we do narrative change work in relation to the economy.
Yeah, for sure. Amadakiapi, Nick Tilson, Amachiapi, Chotea, Washtena, Pachuzapalo, Nick Tilson, Gichima, Lakota language, calling in here from my homelands in the Osheti Shakoi out here. I think one of the really important things when we think about colonialism and settler colonialism in particular, the systems that came along with it create the exact injustices that Peggy was pointing to. And I appreciate what Peggy said too, because I gained an understanding of why I have indigestion, with incremental changes that I feel seen in that, in what you shared there, big time. Why it's so important for us to address, decolonial frameworks and address colonialism is because the systems that were created have a direct correlation to the injustices that we're dealing with today. So, for example, when they built the American political system, when they created the Bureau of Land Management, when they created the Forest Service, when they created the National Park Service, those were institutions created for the purpose to steal Indigenous people's land and extract the resources from them, and give corporations more rights and power on public lands in America. And they were created for the purpose of extraction. That's why those institutions have a direct correlation to the 1872 general mining law that allows corporations to extract from those communities. And so the thing that we have to understand, those things created all of that extraction. And then as you see how it relates to economics, for every $1 that a white person has in this country, a Native person has 8 cents. That represents a 92% racial wealth gap between Indigenous people and white folks. That wasn't an accident. And if you look at the way in which white folks have gained intergenerational wealth in this country, it has been through land. It has been through land. So that's why land back is a decolonial framework. It is a dismantle the system framework, but it also isn't, it's not just tear it all down. It's tear it down and rebuild an economic system that is reflective of our values as a collective people right now in the 21st century. What does that look like? And what is possible in that? But we have to simultaneously be dismantling these unjust systems while we're building new systems. Otherwise, we will constantly have incremental change, and we're going to constantly have indigestion from it all the time, you know. And so that's so much of the work that NDN Collective does is about investing into the self-determination of Indigenous people that are doing the work of defending, developing, and decolonizing simultaneously, because those not only contribute to helping directly impacted people who have been suffering in this current system, but also it begins to create models that can contribute to how we get out of this madness in implementing, you know, things like traditional Indigenous ecological knowledge into land management practices or into community wealth building practices or what have you. So that's why I think this work is fundamentally, you know, so important to do and to contextualize and build narratives around that. And that's what the land back movement is about. It's not about incremental change. It's about structural change. And it's not just about Indigenous communities. It's about, you know, how do we build a more just and equitable world for all people and Mother Earth at the same time?
Thanks, Nick. Well, I want to get to some of the questions. So the first one, you know, is just, I'll state this simply and then I'll complicate it a little bit. But the question is, what are the challenges and harmful narrative roadblocks that we face? And I'll complicate it a little bit by saying, you know, are there specific areas where we think there are levers to actually to shift the outcome? So you can just talk about the one or talk about also, you know, what we can do about some of these roadblocks. So anyone want to jump in on that?
I can start, Steve, if that's all right. So when I think about challenges, it's like it's not in a vacuum, and it's for what? It's always narrative for what, right? And I'm gonna start by following the train where Nick was taking us, which was we have to start from the point of understanding that we have an economy that is purposely stealing through theft, exploiting, and excluding Black, Indigenous, Latinx, many Asian Pacific Islander groups, that there is an intentional mean to exploit and steal from those folks so that the economy moves in the way it was designed to move. And if you understand that, you have to start from a place of like, so what are the narratives that have to be in place to institutionalize that? And I'll start with white supremacy and a racial hierarchy. The understanding of white supremacy and a racial hierarchy deeply seated in people's minds has to be in place in order to do that. Because if you're operating on a pure kind of we're all human beings standpoint, there is no room for theft, exploitation, and exclusion of other people. So you have to deeply seed that in people's minds. So when we talk about the narrative challenge that we're facing today, for me, it's like we have to start there. So then how does that show up, right, is the way we start to answer that question, right? It is the layering and hierarchy of people, not first putting white people at the top and then from there, this like shifting back and forth depending on where you are. Like, oh, well, maybe it's Black people today. Maybe it's Latino people today. Maybe it's indigenous people today. And then, so we're in this space of like, we're constantly figuring out where we fit in this hierarchy that we didn't even create. And then you get to a place of like, but in the end, it's really to establish the supremacy of whiteness. And we'd hear it all the time. When we hear the word American, we think whiteness. When we hear citizen, we think whiteness. When we hear terms like middle class and working class, when we hear family, it defaults to whiteness. And all of this happens within our economic discussions. All this happens within our economic conversations. And then go to the other place. When we think of the underserved, we think of people of color. When we hear subsidy or poverty or something that the government is doing for people, we think of people of color. And for me, it's like we have to understand what we're living in and we have to call it out, because if we don't, all we're doing is reinforcing it. All we're doing is continuing to perpetuate it, and all we're doing is living in it. So for me, when you ask what do we do, the first step is to really interrogate our understanding of how the economy works and what it is doing, and being brutally honest about what it is, so that we can start to think of another vision for the future. And for us at Liberation Generation is to move to a liberation economy, right? One that all people's basic needs are met. All people have safety and security. All people have access to our values, and all people belong. Like, so there's a different framework we have to move to, but in order to get there, we have to be brutally honest about where we are and really interrogate our own understanding about what's going on.
Thanks, Jeremie. Anyone want to build on that? That was great.
Yeah, the thing that I want to add is what is also along exactly those lines of like, a lot of the narrative then means that you have to blame people for their circumstance and not blame the system for putting them in that circumstance or the implications of this of what the system is doing to them. And you have to also tell narratives of how any gain by those folks is a loss for others. So we've constructed this like the pie is only so big. And so we just have to put up with a certain set of people have to have less because then that threatens the more that other people have. And that the salute, and one of the things I think around the fix is when someone comes to you with a recommendation or of how they would solve the problem, the first step is to ask who is going to make money off of that solution that they have now presented to you. Because when we don't do that, we forget to, we make the missteps in the incrementalism that prevent us from getting to justice. So for example, when we talk about housing affordability, oftentimes all that people talk about is supply and building more housing. But who benefits off of that sort of construct when actually, you know, maybe we need more to build more housing, but we also need people to have more money so that they can afford the housing that already exists. Is just an example, I think, of how this narrative can show up in ways and lead us to the wrong solution, and oftentimes a solution that's profitable for a certain segment of people.
Hey, Steve, I wanted to add on to that real quick. Just around particularly like the deficit narrative. Like, people forgot that we can innovate. We can actually create something radically different. And I think that people become complacent, like because of capitalism and because of the form of democracy that has been imposed in America. It has restricted innovation. It has limited people thinking of what is actually possible. And I think that this is a real issue when and you see it, whether it be critical race theory, or whether when I talk about land back and white people lock the door and look out the blinds of their houses, is fragility. Fragility can be, but fragility exists because of lack of a political analysis of the situation that we are faced with. Like Peggy was referring to, like, we have to have an understanding of systems, and we have to have a shared political analysis and understanding of that we're talking about systems. And then people can stop hiding behind fragility and specifically about how they benefit from the current system at play. When the reality is, in order to dismantle a system and build something radically different, that it requires all of us to stand in a circle around it as equals, and understand that in order for us to rebuild to build new systems, the power structures need to change within the new systems that we build, and the economic conditions need to change within, and we have to be equally dedicated to those things. So, at Indian Collective, although my focus is, I focus exclusively focusing on Indigenous people. That's who we fund, that's who we support, but we do it in the effort of creating a more just and equitable world for all people in Mother Earth. That is our lens, that is our analysis. In the same way that the curb cut, helped move the equity movement and help create opportunity for all people, I have a strong belief that when you support Indigenous people in this political and economic system that we operate ourselves in, there can be lessons learned in that process that contribute to a radically different multiracial democracy that is a reflective of where our people are currently at. And so it is about intention, and it's about possibility at the same time. And I think we can create just about anything at this point. And I think that some of the crumbling that we're dealing with, I think there's a lot of people who are like, oh man, American democracy is crumbling, all this stuff is crumbling, and it's doomsday. And I'm like, I see nothing but opportunity in this current situation at hand. And so, like, this is like, I'm ready to go to work,
And Nick, I want to follow up. I'm going to direct this at you, but it's for the whole panel. And Jess would love for you to jump in perhaps after Nick. But I think we've already started to get a little bit at what are the news stories that we need to tell. But now I guess I want to dig a little bit deeper. So that is the first part of the question. What are the news stories that we need to tell? But more so, what is the strategy to get these news stories saturated and immersed across society? So I think a lot of folks, when they think about narrative, they think about comms in strategic communications in the way that we kind of traditionally go about it. But I know that me and you, when we think about narrative, it is in relation to organizing. So can you kick us off and draw the through line between narrative, organizing, policy, and culture, and how all those things are interrelated and interconnected, and what a strategy can be to get these news stories out into the world and immersed across society?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big one. But I'll say this: America has a serious appetite for true authenticity. I mean, I think that when I think about the land back movement, that was not created by a marketing firm, that was not created by a think tank. In fact, the fact that the marketing firms and the public relations people, all that, they said, it's not going to work. It's going to terrify the white people. It's going to create a more divisive space. It ain't going to work. My first thing was like, yo, send me an invoice. It was worth every penny. Thank you. When I went to the grandmas in my community, I said, what does land back mean to you? And they almost cried when I asked them that question, because they said, it means, wow. For one, nobody's asked me that before. Number two, it means everything that was taken from us when they took the land. And when I went to a young person and said, what does land back mean to you? And they were like, hell yeah. I can see myself in that. Multi-generationalism in movements is what will sustain narratives for the long haul. We don't need the latest, sexiest thing to be, put in the end zones of the NFL and have it have incremental impact. Yes, I said that and took a shot at some of that, because we need narratives that are going to stick around for the long haul, because we got some serious work to be doing. So I think that a lot of times that the world of communications, marketing firms, and the data organizations that support those, they are disconnected, very disconnected from impacted people. And so you end up with those informing who, quote unquote, does narrative change work, giving them misguided and misdirected information. Because powerful narratives happen when you build a political analysis from the ground up. And that our identities are attached to it. Our very survival as a people is attached to it. Those have longevity. And then we can get into strategies of how that authenticity gets into what we consider the mainstream. And in the end, I'll be honest, I never build communications and narrative for external audiences first. I never do that. My audience is always the grassroots person living on the res. That's who I am communicating to first. It doesn't mean that I don't communicate to other people. It means that I have prioritized the impacted people, because that is who I am trying to move to action. And for other folks, it's an opportunity to peer into what is happening in our movement, what is happening and I think that there's some lessons learned that come out of that come out of those places. And I think that sometimes people are like, wow, you got to get out of the echo chamber. I was like, shit, I live in an echo chamber. I organize in an echo chamber. And I believe that this echo chamber has a lot to offer the rest of the world. But I'm not going to change what's going on in this echo chamber to make it digestible for them. I'm going to come at it just as hard as we're talking about it on Pine Ridge as we are in other places. And I think that people have the appetite for it, and so I just think that sometimes people like that in the space we discredit people. We discredit before we have the opportunity, because sometimes we say, well, the data says this. And I'm like, I've seen us as organizers call bullshit on the data over and over and over, and how that has contributed to radical liberatory type of change in this country. So I think that's how I don't even know if I answered the question, but that's how I feel about what you said.
I think you did. I think you definitely did. And it was a big question. And Jess, I want to bring you in to see if you have thoughts about that, and Common Future, kind of where you all are situated as an intermediary, what you think and how we should all be thinking about narrative strategies, given that we're all situated in different spaces and at different levels of the ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. And first of all, Nick, you live the questions. You are the questions. And I have gained so much from understanding not only the intergenerational resonance, which I think is necessary, but this notion of how we show up, the authenticity that we crave and who we really are as individuals. When we can get to that core, when we're unguarded, when we are real, there's high degrees of resonance. And so I think a lot at Common Future about cross-racial solidarity, the collective project of the multiracial democracy we need to build, because by 2044, our country will be quote unquote majority minority. It'll be new majority. It'll be more folks of color than not. If you look at the data around racial wealth gap, we cannot move to that moment with folks having falling wealth. We can't be a country of zero wealth. And so when I think about the multiracial democracy we all want, it requires intergenerational narratives. It requires cross-racial solidarity in our narratives. And it is a real opportunity, I think, for us to really sit with who we are and who we want to be as a nation. This nation is made of nothing, if not broken promises. but they're promises nonetheless. We have every day is an opportunity to live up to those promises and to be better than the last. So in the ways that I think, turning it to your question, Trevor, and thinking about Common Future's take on how we see these narratives, we think, again, cross-racial solidarity and intergenerational, but really with resonance towards what's Gen Z going to think about this? How is the content going to carry and become bigger than itself? And we're studying and learning from social and new media, and we're upending the ways that organizations, again, traditionally use these things to tell a story and make it more resonant, make it more real to people in different ways. Two examples from Common Future already came up in the context of this panel, and one, I'll look back to Jeremie's shirt. Economic justice is racial justice. This is Common Future swag. And it represents a goal that I think we've held for a long time at Common Future, the idea that streetwear, you can make something cool. If you want to be wearing it, if the message means something to you, folks are going to read it and they're going to resonate with it. I can't tell you, Jeremie, the number of times I've worn that sweatshirt around Brooklyn and gotten questions about, like, who's the brand behind this? And I'm like, well, it's not a brand. Because to Nick's point, we don't need brands and PR. It's Common Future. It's a collective of real people who think this is what they want to see in the world. And so they put it on a shirt. It also speaks to our Instagram. If you flash back a year or two ago, our Instagram, was like everyone else's Instagram. We posted organizational updates. Now I want you to go to @CommonFuturists right now, particularly because there's a beautiful illustration of none other than Trevor, and featuring his words, his work, and the work of BLIS Collective. We know that these images need to be beautiful. If you look at Instagram today, we will like and share messages that are strong, that speak to current events and get information out there. And we'll share messages that are from the heart, that are beautiful, that are the world we want to see. Because I think for all of us, when we log in, there is a lot of doom and gloom. For those of us that are activists, there's a lot of work we can do in that space. But if you get a moment of calm, that's rare. And so we're trying to deliver that to younger generations and hope that that content really carries.
Great, thanks. Well, I'll jump in with a question, and and I think that I'll direct us to Peggy to begin with, but others can also jump in. So the question is, what narrative shortcuts have gotten in the way of transformative economic change? And Peggy, the reason I thought of you in this is you were talking about how some reforms can undermine justice and others can advance it. So, I'm interested in your take and of others on the panel of, how do you make that determination? We have an upcoming article that's going to be on something called non-reformist reform. So the idea has been out there, but how do you actually, in Washington or elsewhere, make sense of this?
Well, I think one of the first things that we have to do is adopt some reflexivity in thinking about, like, things that we thought in the past were gains. Were they really gains? Who lost? Why are we still in the same state that we're in? So you take a policy like the Affordable Care Act, where that we, that's still, like, the infrastructure of the country, says that it was a good thing and increased healthcare, increased access to healthcare. But there's still a huge group of people that are left behind, right? Many people living in the South were left behind because of not having Medicaid expansion. Some of these things were predictable, but we didn't necessarily name them at the time. Some of them are outcomes because really, right, we think of the ACA, people can talk about the Affordable Care Act as transformation, but it wasn't. People primarily still get their health insurance from their job. Which, is problematic. And so, to say the least, problematic's doing a lot in that sentence. So, right, like, yes, so people, but still, like, today, we're trumpeting the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, whatever it is, President Biden saying he wants to protect it. And so how do we, like, have that reflexivity to think about, to really analyze something that we think needs to improve or could have been better, so that then the next time we do it better and we name the things that were a problem, or we figure out or the next time is, you know what? We did this thing, we sort of got some stuff, but really the construct that we used to get it was wrong. We need this new construct in order to get to like healthcare for all, for example, right? And so that being able to, but right, that's hard. That can be hard for people who were in that fight with the Affordable Care Act. Their ego is wrapped up in that as a win, and that millions of people did get access to health insurance. And so, so it is, that's something that only in the last few years have I really been able to articulate more, is the role that ego plays in what we decide or decide not to fight for, and how much we need to name that and start to and call people out when their ego is getting in the way, call ourselves out when our ego is getting in the way of really that true transformation, of true transformation. Because the other way that our egos get in the way is being only living in the art of the possible. And so, like as Nick said, like, only thinking that we must do only what we can win is just huge, because it means that we're only going to try the things that we can actually imagine. And given that we need to break out of that and live in a space where we're moving towards something that we haven't actually lived in before, requires this ability to we have to get our egos out of it, because we can't think that we're the ones that even hold the answer. Being here in this space is another community of people that gives us all the energy to be able to move forward. And the courage to move forward, even if we don't know what the end exact precisely is. What we do all know is what we want the end to look like. And that has to be what how we examine those incremental things. Is this in any way mirroring the world how we want the world to look? And if it is not, then we have to stop and break it back apart to build the new thing that we want to create.
Thanks, Peggy. I'm gonna follow up because there's something in your question that I think connects back to what Nick and Jess were talking about as far as like what are the shortcuts. And one of the shortcuts I think is one that we have to do because it's what's available to us, which is I believe that we are by default, when we're thinking about narrative, how are we going to shift, what messages should we use? How should we, what should our campaigns kind of talking points be? We shift to going to what is a traditional media narrative infrastructure. So your comms firms, your think tanks, no shade, Peggy, I'm not talking about the center, but like your think tanks, your kind of policy advocacy organizations. And what I've found is that they are operating in a world that assumes and actually accepts the existence of white supremacy. Therefore, the messages that they put out and the people who inform those messages when they do focus groups, when they do is those same groups that I mentioned earlier that signal to whiteness. You're Americans, you're citizens, what I talked about earlier. But what's missing is the insight of the folks Nick was talking about, the people on the res, the Black folks at the barbershop and the beauty salon, the Latino men and women that I see like everywhere you go in the service industry, right? Like there isn't a thought about what is it, and we don't have an infrastructure really to pull out what they think and what their understanding of the world can inform. And I challenge to say that if we did that, and I think about this actually with, I was thinking about this the other day as we think about reparations. One of the things you bring up reparations, people are like, well, that'll never happen. It's right. It was never happened. And I'm sure that Nick hears that with land back a lot of times. Like, oh, it never happened. It never happened. It never happened. And I argue to say that, like, if we actually, and we hear that from our own folks, right? People in community. I'd venture to say that just the act of having the conversation to collect the data about what people think and bringing that into a conversation is the process you have to go through to make something that feels almost impossible actually obtainable. So actually the act and practice of creating narrative and shifting narrative, and narrative that is informed and fed by the people who are going to be most impacted by the change you're trying to make, is actually part of the process to get to that change. So when we talk about shortcuts, Steve, I think when we default to the experts, meaning the experts at the, in the ivory towers and the institutions and blah, 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 we're actually shortcutting a process that is going to bring us to where we want to be. And that's something that I'm often thinking about, is what is we, Liberation and Generation, as a different type of utility out there in the movement space? How can we shift the way that we do our work so that we're not falling and creating those shortcuts that are going to limit our ability to get to where we want to go?
And I just want to build on that, because what we do is we equate messaging to people with narrative change, and those are not the same thing. There may be concentric circles, but it's not the same thing. And so we ask these questions of people from a messaging standpoint of like, what message resonates with you, rather than, and that, which is, it helps learn a lot, but it's not narrative. It's not, we can use that to then inform narrative maybe, but it's not the narrative change that we want to see. And that, because that's, yeah, the number of times we ask like white people if we want to take their power, would they be okay with that? Like, I'm like, why are we asking? I don't want to ask. I want to just explain why we all need to achieve justice. Instead, can we just stop asking people how they feel about redistribution of their wealth? Like, I just don't it kills me. But so keep doing the messaging, fine, whatever. But let's shift to owning what we want the world to be and saying that out loud so that people can in a way that people can understand what we're talking about. Like,
that's really helpful, Peggy. And I think where I want to go next with our next question is around the racial wealth gap. And I think the work that you're talking about is long-term work. Narrative and culture change work is long-term work. And so there, over the past couple of years, perhaps decade, there's been, I think, a deeper understanding of the racial wealth gap. But I think with that, there's still some misunderstanding. So can you all, this is for the entire panel, talk a little bit about what are the nuances that we need to understand about the racial wealth gap, particularly as it's kind of gained popularity across society and across our social justice spaces?
I'll start. I have a lot of thoughts about this, so I'll try to be succinct. So I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about the racial wealth gap is this idea that we are going to, like, person by person individualize our way out of it. So like these, and the data points to this, right? So there was a recent research study by Eleanor Derencourt, that found that if you gave every Black person like reparations, and I'm not saying, look, I believe all Black people should get reparations on the size and scale that Sandy Darity and other researchers have pointed out. But even if you did that, the structures and systems of our economy will take that back almost immediately and reestablish the racial wealth gap. What does that tell us? That tells us that that at the same time that we're focusing on making up for the wealth gap that has been created through, say, reparations or some other policy, we have to address the systems and structures that created in the first place. So I get frustrated when people say, well, for example, what's tax policy got to do with the racial wealth gap? I say everything. What does shareholder primacy have to do with the racial wealth gap? I say everything, because Black and brown people, because of structures of racism, don't own stock and shares of of companies. So to me, it's like, if we're going to address the racial wealth gap, we have to address the systemic structures, which means that Bank of America offering first-time home buyer opportunities for Black people, which they should, is not going to close the racial wealth gap. Bank of America, not being an extractive institution that extracts wealth from Black people, is something that can close the racial wealth gap. And you can't have one without the other. So for me, that is the thing that I think is most misunderstood about the racial wealth gap, is that it's going to take wide systematic change to even get to any semblance of idea that we can close it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that we talk about this is part of what I talked about before around who is making money off of the idea they're trying to sell us is going to solve my problem. And, you know, a lot of the solutions are not, you know, maybe someone will be a little better off or whatever, but it's not solving the racial wealth gap. And the other thing is, I think right in this liberation space, the whole wealth thing, like first and foremost, we need to redefine what we mean by wealth in general, in order to get at the solution as well. So I think that's one of also in building off of what Jeremie said, right? They're making us do this rat race to say close the racial wealth gap, that it actually is not it. It's not it.
Yeah, I was gonna add. Oh, go ahead, Jess.
Go for it, Nick.
Well, I was going to say, capitalism is one of the reasons the racial wealth gap exists. I mean, we are underneath the wrong economic system, and as long as, you know, that whole, you know, as long as we decide, hey, we're just going to be a bunch of Native and Black and Asian and Islander capitalists, everything's going to work out. The reality is, we will just contribute to classism. We will contribute to future destruction of Mother Earth, and we will widen the separation between the rich and the poor, and it will just have more people that have color in it. It'll still perpetuate injustice in society. And this is like, you know, that's why I think that, like, when we create solutions around racial wealth gap, we have to think about new definitions. And I'll put one on here. You know, we created a program here at Indian Collective. We had this partnership with the Bush Foundation out of the Twin Cities, and we received $50 million to create to redistribute that to Indigenous people in the tri-state area of Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, But in the process of doing that, we redefined what wealth meant on Indigenous terms. And after I'm done talking, I'll drop it into the chat here. But we surveyed over 5,000 Indigenous people in this just in these 3 states. And there's 23 different Native nations that share the geography of these 3 states. And the holistic approach that came out of those communities was really, really powerful, because it put well-being, it put culture, it put identity, belonging, these types of words into what we're talking about when we want a more just economy. And that economy is a mechanism to deliver justice. It's not just a byproduct. It's not just a byproduct of it. And so I think that is something that has to be radically different for us to imagine what that looks like. And that's why I think really leaning into community wealth building solutions. How do community wealth building solutions? How does shared ownership over land and resources and those things being implemented? I mean, just because we're in perpetual destructive and extractive capitalism right now doesn't mean we always have to be. And as we fight to close the racial wealth gap, I see those things as married up with one another, you know. But it requires policy change. It requires tax law change. It requires to force the systems that are currently perpetuating it. We have to force them to change. We can't expect them to change because they're gaining too much money and wealth off the current system as it has right now, and that's where, you know, the act of social justice is required in order to do that. And I'll say this: you know, that's the systems change level. I do think it's important that we continue to invest into examples of what it looks like, when equitable distribution of wealth begins to start to happen under new definitions, because then I think that we make efforts to get there. And so that's some of the stuff that we're doing here at Indian Collective. We're distributing $10 million or about $8 million a year for the next 5 years to these different models, but it's under the new definition of wealth, not mainstream capitalism definition too.
And you set me up so well there, Nick, because I think at Common Future, our theory of change is quite similar to Indians in the ways that we're investing straight up into the solutions that are extant. I think when I hear about Jeremie referencing the research by Delancourt, the idea that the racial wealth gap will remake itself, I mean, that's by design. That is absolutely structural. Not only because of the root causes and the systems change that we need to expose to be able to shift the nature of the challenge, but also like folks want to hear it's an easy fix. Frankly, to hear there's a wealth gap and whether it's land back or reparations are the silver bullets feels easy and is an easy spot for resistance. So I want to think about how the narratives around just how the gap recreates itself, it's a beast, and really calling out the nature of the beast helps us understand it better. Like Indiana, as I was saying, we at Common Future, we invest directly in Black and Indigenous folks. And Nick was speaking earlier to ingenuity and innovation, the fact that folks know how to get their ways out of these racial wealth gaps. They know what's wrong with capitalism. They have built other solutions, and we've got to remember there are other ways. There have been other ways. We have been on this planet for tens of thousands of years, and there's other ways to live than under capitalism. And what we do at Common Future, yes, there's any innovation and new ideas, and we're so excited to invest into them. But there's a lot of things that have been here. We look at non-extractive finance, 0% interest finance, that's Islamic finance. That goes back centuries. We look at cooperative economics and their history here in the US, which goes back to the moment that Black folks were brought to this soil against their will. We look at susus and giving in communities back in Africa. We look at many different ways that funding and money has moved differently. Power and wealth has been shared by definition. And this is not rocket science. It's actually what was and is normative. We just have to believe in it again. And so at Common Future, we don't do anything new. We don't do anything radical. We just evince what's already there. And I think what is so tremendous, shocking, scary, but also I think like everyone here, I see the glass half full. We have such an opportunity just to show what's already happening. And there's not going to be a silver bullet, but also in the many ways that we invest, in the many models that we have, in the many ways that we move, there's less ability to resist us. We are powerful because we are many. The number of models and leaders and folks who know how to do this to create a more equitable economy, they're already here and they're already doing it. What we lack sometimes is power that is political. What we lack sometimes that is capital. It's a measure of power. And that's, I think, where the solidarity between the work that we collectively do, the folks here, becomes all the more relevant.
Thanks. I'm going to move to audience questions. There are a few of them, and I'll start with this one because I think it kind of follows on what was just asked. So the questioner says, I'm curious what the panelists think about narrative shift from anti-racism or racial justice to targeted universalism. So there's a lot of different frameworks that are thrown about, and any thoughts on those existing frames?
No, I can start on this because we've done some talking about this internally on our team a lot. And I guess I don't see it as a shift, or I hope the shift isn't that direction. I hope the shift isn't from thinking big to thinking small. The way that we sort of think about those different concepts is again in sort of this continuum. And thinking about racial justice is the goal, and so we're not shifting away from that. That is what we want. What it is how to get there. And targeted universalism is a mechanism that people are exploring. I'm sorry, to help us think about how to do incrementalism. Right, that's the thing. And so that's the way I would encourage the questioner to think about it, is not a shift toward, because we don't want to go backwards. We want to go forwards. I'm going to stop now.
Peggy, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's contingent on us to really hold the line, particularly in this moment where there are coordinated attacks on racial justice progress, economic justice progress, and DEI in particular. There is a hot debate on this. There's a hot debate internally that honestly, it's not so hot. We see all sides, yet we know exactly in our guts what we have to do. Just last week, Trevor and I were at the School World Forum in Oxford, UK, and Common Future held a closed-door roundtable to talk about just what is going to be our coordinated offense around the racial justice backlash, particular to funding, but it also, a lot of times it comes down to narrative. And the hottest debates in the room, there were folks from PolicyLink, from Demos, like really colleagues who have studied this and have the research. And the debate was still live because this idea of whether we stand our ground and remain race explicit or back into targeted universalism or employ a narrative structure that I talked about with Steve a couple of weeks ago that just like grinds my gears is the race class narrative. I've seen it well employed. I see it as a place where you can move a movable metal, but at what cost? I think when we have to bring class into it, when we have to target the universalism, we are not being specific about the nature of what is going on here. We are not being as race explicit as we need to be. We're not facing the problem, tackling the problem. And so in all these rooms, yes, there is debate, but I see folks coming down very clearly on the long game, on racial justice, on remaining explicit. We cannot afford to have to step back because we feel like we're in a corner. That's the tactic. And we don't need to cower or respond in that way. There are ways to move through this moment and other moments of backlash while keeping a long view. At least that's my belief.
I was wondering if, I hope others can jump in on this question of, we are in a moment of backlash, so how we respond to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's right. I second Jess, and I think for my contribution to this question is that if we are doing racial justice work, any effort to center whiteness is going to set us back, because in order to move forward, we have to be real about the dynamics we live in, the history that has created it, and the intentionality behind it. And if we're centering white comfort in that work, then it is going to set us back, and there's no way around it. So I get why it's happening. I've been in this work long enough to know why it's happening. But I think if the question was how do we move forward, we have to move forward, I think, by acknowledging and pushing through efforts to center white comfort and whiteness. So that's my response to that.
And I think that leads in, I'm going to combine two audience questions. Somebody asked, if not incrementalism, then what is the theory of change for systemic change around wealth inequality? And I'm going to combine that with another question, which I'm sure a lot of folks here might be hearing about land back or reparations for the first time. And so somebody else asked, how are we defining land back and reparations? So both, if not incrementalism, then what? And how are we defining reparations and land back in this space?
Well, I'll combine an answer that answers part of that other question. It's about roles. In any movement, there's different roles. I know what NDN's role is. I know where we stand. It is not our role to water down the narrative for the climate that we are in. We will go hard in the paint forever, because that's who we are. Because if we don't, then it makes our people invisible. Why am I rallying around a land back narrative? Because it calls for structural change and makes our people's struggles visible. It holds the mirror up to false narratives. Most of the public lands in America is mismanaged by the federal government. these false narratives. Well, Indian people don't know how to manage their land. I bet the audience doesn't know that Native people in the United States right now manage 56.2 million acres right now, today. And it is the best managed land in America. And that's why there's federal agencies who are working, and this administration has made it a priority to prioritize the implementation of traditional indigenous ecological knowledge into all public land management practices. That's happening now. That is a result of grassroots organizing, influencing, huge government. And so I think that having movements that have staying power and staying hard in the paint, because it brings people along. In a time when people want to water things down, there has to be some of us that do not do that hold the line on these structural narratives. Because what we do, and I've heard it from tribal leaders over and over, they're like, Nick, I've had tribal leaders in this region like, Nick, we did not lose the language of white supremacy or decolonization. We did not use those things. But NDN pushing those narratives out there in the world made it okay. And now it has become a part of our lexicon and has become part of our political analysis. All of a sudden, and they're in a different place of influence than we are as grassroots organizers and grant makers and lenders and developers, And so those things are really, really important in this time. I think that when it comes to those of us who decide we are not going to meet in the middle ground, that we are going to stay on the edge, it is a important thing that people understand that as a strategy to keep us moving forward and to resource us and support us, rather than to lean into old school respectability politics and say, those are the fringe people, they're the fringe. But the reality is those of us that are quote unquote fringe, we've been moving this ship along. We've been moving this along a long time, and so I think that that's really important, and I think it's important that we really attach ourselves to structural changes of what is possible, meaning like the conversations around reparations. Without land back and reparations, will we achieve racial equity in America? No. So let's not lift our pedal from the metal. We have to keep it on there. We can keep our pedal on the metal and have the conversations as we go. And I think that part is really, really important. And I think that when there's stuff like we've seen with affirmative action, and we've seen the chilling effect that these adjacent lawsuits that have happened after the affirmative action decision, the chilling effect that has, it's also an excuse. It also tells people, oh, you know what? It's a little risky for us to support, critical race theory. It is a little risky for us to support Black feminist or Indigenous-led funds. It's a little risky for us to do that. And they barely came to the party in the first place, so they were already looking for a place to fucking go anyway, And the reality is, we're still going to be here. And this is where the party's at. And this is moving the dial. Remember how we got here. Have we forgot what happened between, 2018 and 2023? A lot of shit happened, and the people created that, And so I think that there's just we just got to keep going hard and having to have, and pushing those where resources are coming from is really important. It's one of the reasons why we focus so much energy on that, is because it's an organizing strategy. NDN fucks with philanthropy because it's a way to change power structures. And it so happens to be that our people need the resources to build these revolutionary movements of change. Doesn't hurt, or to believe, solutions for community wealth building. So I just think, that's what I'll say about that one. Yeah.
If I jump in, and Trevor, you're being modest. I mean, if anyone on this panel has the right? The ability to define reparations. You know, your work through Liberation Ventures and BLIS, you should do that. So I'm not going to do that part of the question. But what I will respond to is this incremental question. And I'm so happy that Peggy brought up the kind of discomfort we feel with incrementalism. And my feeling about why it's so uncomfortable is because it's not, the things that we feel are incremental are not anchored to a larger vision. Like those incremental steps, we know it's long off. It's a long journey to get to land back, to get to reparations. Liberation Generation, we put out a set of like government guarantees that we believe would define what is the liberation economy, and reparations is a part of that through a guaranteed inheritance. But we know that that's far off, but we have to take steps, right, to get there. There's a journey. And those incremental steps can be a part of that journey if we know that they're anchored to the destination. But when they're just kind of anchored to, well, that's what we could get this time, then it feels hollow. It feels like a hollow victory. So my feeling about incrementalism is not that there's a problem with it for its own self. It's that if not anchored to a vision and to a place that we want to go, we don't feel like we're making progress. And I think that if people feel like progress is happening, then we can, then that those incremental wins feel like we're gaining ground and they have more power.
And Jeremie,
to define reparations at some point. Yeah, go ahead, Jess.
Absolutely. And you're not speaking enough to the work that you've done. Dare I call the framework you put out there in your response to incrementalism, radical pragmatism.
Yes.
Radical pragmatism. That's another great resource to stick in the chat. But it's holding both. The vision has to be radical. We hold the line. We got to be pragmatic about what those steps look like. I would argue not every step is an incremental step if you keep the system, if you're really knocking down the leverage points, if there's a deep theory to why you've made that move. It's all part of tumbling the thing down. And so while the indigestion is real, I do think a stepwise pragmatic approach to like, what are the wins and advances we can get? What are those that we not only get, but we can safeguard? What's the coverage we provide for others? These are all different ways to move, different dynamics and modalities of our movement spaces. And if we keep the radical, but hold the pragmatic, we actually hopefully get some wins.
And that's the key part too, is keeping the radical. So the narrative part should not be incremental, right? The narrative of what we're saying has to be visionary. It has to be moving forward. We should not be changing our narrative because of what we can win, right? So that has to be helped. And that's something that this conversation has helped me. Like, I never really thought about the need to articulate that part until right now. And it's the acts and the things that we're doing that lives in this incrementalism space that's marching toward the vision that we want to see the world. But I think that's really important because I hadn't thought about how often people want me to change what I say to meet the moment rather than helping the moment meet what we want the world to be.
Great. I'm going to jump in with a couple audience questions. I'm going to try to combine them. So these are both.
Wait, Steve,
questions.
before we go there, can Trevor give the definition?
Trevor, you want to give the definition? Go ahead. Sure.
Well, I dropped a couple links in the chat, so if you go to the BLIS website, we have grounding definitions, and we use on the BLIS website, we use in COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, we use their definition of reparations, a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families. But I think the beautiful thing about reparations is that you can use that definition, but I think there's a larger framework. And we talked about this in the Reparations Narrative Lab, the work I was doing at Liberation Ventures. I use Olufemi Taiwo's kind of world-making framework. And to me, reparations is a world-making project. It is an economic, political, and cultural project that seeks to create a new world. And to me, the work of reparations is not over until we uproot anti-Blackness. And we're not going to uproot anti-Blackness by just the exchanging of funds and closing the Black-white wealth gap. And so to me, when we put that at the center of reparations work, it pushes us to think about it in a long-term way. And if it took centuries to create anti-Black narratives, then it should and will likely take us a lot longer than just kind of closing a wealth gap to actually complete the project of reparations.
Thanks, Trevor. So I'm going to try to jump to a couple of audience questions, which are really around how people can plug into the work. So there was a question about how can community newspapers be utilized for sharing narratives and solutions and policies? And there's another question that's similarly worded about what can folks at universities do to support this work? So any thoughts on either, where academics can be of assistance or journalists? Yeah.
I would say the journalist training piece is huge. It's part of the narrative infrastructure we need to build. Part of what I mentioned earlier around stealth communications is working in these ways. It's prepping journalists. It's making sure that there is a beat that covers the type of work that is happening here. Reparations and land back deserve and need a space that is carved out in local and national media. But to do that, you gotta hook the very folks who are telling stories. And so some of that we've done with partners like Imperative 21 is really develop curricula and engagement strategies to just get the journalist brief, get them in the room. I will say once people learn this stuff, you can't unsee it. They'll pursue, they'll be curious. The stories do tell themselves. But there is a role, I think, for each of us to think about proactive engagement of journalists who are looking for these stories, are looking for solutions journalism and narratives of work that's actually happening. And it's contingent on organizations like ours, I'll speak for Common Future as an intermediary, to make those connections for folks.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, my advice is kind of similar for both. It's important that we end up having journalists who aren't here to just tell our stories, but that get training and developing their political understanding, a political analysis of what we're talking about, rather than just looking for voices of subject matters. Oh, let's call Jeremie, let's call Jess, just calling quote unquote who have ever been lifted up as experts, right? But I think it's important for journalists to develop their political analysis, not just the talking points we deliver to them, because in narrative work we do that, right? Here's what we want you to deliver, but it's a total different thing. Other thing is that because journalism is changing so much, and every one of us on this call has our own platforms in which we're producing original content that is not influenced by corporate America or whoever's owning the media. When you take interviews with us, the vast majority of the shit we're talking about, we have written about on our platforms, unedited, in true voice. Lift those things up. Use your access in the field of academia and journalism to lift up some of those. Put those in your reference points when you do the interviews with us, because I think that it will make them stronger. And quite frankly, it makes the journalism a lot more authentic. It makes the curriculum that you are developing or having be a lot stronger. And we produce blogs all the time here at NDN. We're not the best at finding ways to quote unquote distribute that, but whenever we do connect with journalists, we ask them to lift it up and and to use it as reference points, because we might say whatever we'll get quoted in an article, but here's more that exists there. I think that's important. Other thing too is I think that to understand that the framework should be that we're underway right now. Land back is underway. There's hundreds of land back efforts happening in real time. If we think of it as a destination, well, we're there. We're there because it's a practice. It's becoming a standard practice. It's happening in urban places. It's happening in rural places. It's happening throughout North America. In every single political and social context that exists in this country, land back is happening in real time right now. And we shouldn't assume, we shouldn't make assumptions that that doesn't exist. And so I think creating threads of like saying and acknowledging, hey, this shit's underway, and let's lift up those stories and those examples, because it begets more stories. To sit down with the director of the National Park Service, and they'll be like, all right, Nick, here's our 37 land back strategies that we're having at the U.S. National Park Service. And I was like, shit, in 2020, I was arrested at a national park, and now we're sitting here having this conversation. This is great, right? And so I just think I think that sometimes when we think of things as a destination, we miss out on the reality that movements are happening right now, and it's in action right now. And so I just really, I want to share that, as a strategy. And I think the same, I think the same way around Black reparations. I think that we have to get to that place with it to make it a standard practice, because it's not a destination, right? It's not going to be like one big thing that's like, oh, we got there,
Yeah, thanks for that, Nick. And want to shout out my co-founder, Savannah Romero, who I think is in the crowd for sure. And some of the conversations that we have all the time, just about communicating to our own communities, and how obviously our communities have shared histories, but still we have diverse experiences and diverse thoughts across our communities. And so wondering and kind of condensing a question from the audience, how do we grapple with that? How do we grapple with the fact that one message might work with one Black person and one message might work with another Black person, or maybe race forward message might work with one person and a class message might work with the other? So how do we grapple with that, the fact that folks are situated at different levels within even our own communities?
I'm so glad you asked that question. So for me, this is another reason why we cannot rely on the traditional narrative infrastructure to craft what we need to say, because their practices will always lump all Black people think this, all Indigenous people think this, all immigrants, which is a crazy diverse group of people, think this, right? So they will always do that, which means we have to create an infrastructure that gets into practice of finding that nuance amongst people and what people think based upon their life and lived experience, so that we have full knowledge of what various Black people think about reparations. Because there's not, Trevor, not all agreement on that. So we have to create an infrastructure that is in the practice of trying to find that nuance, because the current structure is not equipped to do that.
We're kind of at time, folks. So I don't know if there's I can give folks like 5 or 10 seconds, but we really do need to wrap up. Any last comments before I just go to the closing slide? Okay. Well, I want to really thank Trevor Smith again for co-moderating this and helping co-create this webinar, and our panelists, Peggy Bailey from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Jess Feingold from Common Future, Jeremie Greer from Liberation in a Generation, Nick Tilson from NDN Collective, and thanks to all of you for your fantastic questions. We got to as many as we could. Please do fill out the survey at the end. That really does help us. And we do have another webinar coming up on worker self-directed nonprofits in this series on Wednesday, May 15th at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern. So hope you can attend that. And again, many thanks, and hope we can continue the conversation. And the recording and all that information should be out by Monday. So thanks so much.